I'm Andy Agathangelou. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. I started the Transparency Task Force as a result of a speech that I gave on the 6th of May 2015. And the speech was to a room full of quite important financial services people. The speech was all about the idea that there was a terrible disconnect, a terrible disconnect between what the financial services sector ought to be doing and what it was doing. I argued that given the fact that without trust in the financial industry, you really have nothing else, I argued that the financial sector ought to be highly trusted. It should be a highly trusted industry. And I still believe that. I still believe the financial industry ought to be very, very highly trusted, but it's not. And I pointed to some data that proved that it wasn't. At the time, I was able to point to data from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which, if you're familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, very routinely shows the financial services sector to be lacking in trust, let me put it that way. These days, I'm able to draw upon some much more powerful evidence in Violation Tracker. A violation tracker is something I speak about pretty much every opportunity I can get, and I'm going to do it now. And also our first round of speakers are also going to be making reference to violation tracker as well. But what I'm going to do is talk about the very obvious conclusions you come to when you look at the data inside violation tracker as far as the financial services sector is concerned. So let me bring my point to life by showing you something. And I'll put up a link into the chat to enable you all to have a look at this database if you haven't already seen it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on the industry totals here, industry totals. And I would argue that the financial services sector should be nowhere near the top at all. And I'd make this point because if you take trust out of financial services, as I've already said, you really have nothing left. You therefore imagine, wouldn't you, that the entire financial services industry, all the actors, all the market participants, all the stakeholders, all the companies, all the regulators would defend the integrity and reputation and credibility of the financial industry tooth and nail. They would do all they possibly could to make sure that there was no malpractice, no malfeasance, no misconduct, no mis-selling, because that would be a sensible, rational reaction. You know, why jeopardize the integrity of an industry that has to be trusted for it to function successfully? Why jeopardize it by allowing any kind of transgressions or violations at all? So my point is the financial industry should work very, very hard to always defend its integrity, its reputational integrity. But the data doesn't show that at all. Not only is the financial services sector nowhere near where it should be, which is the most trusted, i.e. the least violating industry, it's actually the worst offender of all. The worst offender of all. So here we have it, financial services ranked number one, a staggering figure, $333 billion, 568,388,571 of infringements recorded against organizations in the financial industry since the year 2000. And remember, this is only what gets prosecuted and fined. Of course, there's other stuff going on behind the scenes as well. A staggering figure of 6,826 cases. And to put this into context, ladies and gentlemen, the pharmaceuticals industry, which, as you know, there are no angels, you know, the opioid crisis, for example, the oil and gas industry, again, no angels. Think of all those terrible, terrible oil spillages, etc. Financial services is worse than both of those added together. In fact, it's worse than every single one of these industries added together. And this points to the harsh, staggering realization that there is something going very, very, very badly wrong in the financial industry. How can it be that financial services, the industry that has to be trusted more than all other industries, is somehow being allowed, inverted commas, to be the worst offending industry of all. There is something going seriously wrong there. And then when you click down to the next level of detail, as I'm doing now, we are showing the top 10 worst offending organizations. Here we go. Bank of America, the worst offender, $82 billion worth. JP Morgan Chase, 35 billion, etc. Citigroup, Wells Fargo. You can read it all for yourself. Isn't it embarrassing for us Brits, those of you who are British, that NatWest Group finds itself in the top 10 worst offenders on a US database against US authorities? How bad is that? And then when you look at the individual cases, ladies and gentlemen, what you find is that the same banks are doing the same things over and over again. They call this recidivism, when an individual or an organization does something wrong, gets caught doing it, gets told off and carries on. Does something wrong, gets caught doing it, gets told off, carries on. It's a pattern. And we say that this proves absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, that there is catastrophic regulatory failure. The regulators around the world are failing to make sure that the financial services sector is behaving itself. And then when you think about the revelations, for example, some of you, I'm sure, like me, watched the TV last night, watched the programs about the Pandora Papers. When we think about those issues, when we think about the malpractice and malfeasance in the financial industry as a whole, we really do come to some rather stark conclusions, which is that there is something going terribly wrong. How and why is this relevant to tonight's session? I'll explain. There is no way I can imagine the idea of having a society that is functioning as it should be if we have a financial services industry that isn't. How can you have society being caring and considerate and providing appropriate welfare for those who need it? How can you have a society like that if you have a financial industry that is cutting fast and loose with all kinds of things? I've had numerous conversations over the last few years where, I don't mind saying this, I'm not particularly embarrassed, where I've ended up in tears, yeah, talking to people who've been ripped off by the banks, by the financial services companies who've been ripping people off, and it's so sad, so unbelievably sad. One conversation I'll never ever forget with a lady last week who, cut a long story short, ended up losing her husband, terribly treated by the banks and terribly let down by the regulators. I am becoming increasingly intolerant of the kind of behavior that is going on. If we want society to behave as society should, we must demand that we get a financial industry that is behaving in an honourable, ethical and professional way. If we don't have a financial industry behaving itself, we won't get the kind of society that we want. We'll never have a chance of building back better. Too much money is getting invested into companies that shouldn't be getting any investment at all. Too little money is going into companies that really do warrant having proper backup and support. I could talk about this at length. In fact, given the chance, I would, but I'm not going to. I'm going to park it there. What I am going to do is simply explain why we are running tonight's session. The Building Back Better theme has been around for quite some time. I remember having all kinds of positive, upbeat conversations with people at the beginning of the pandemic, where they were basically saying, this is it, you know, this is the moment, this is the inflection point. We have a confluence of crises, lots of things are going wrong in society. We're in the kind of the post-truth era. We've got a pandemic on our hands. We've got catastrophic climate change coming around the corner. This is it. There's so much wrong going on that we are going to bounce back from this and we're going to be building back better. There's going to be a sense of righteousness, if you like, about the idea that we are all going to behave differently and better post-COVID. And bit by bit, that sentiment seems to be disappearing. I'm genuinely worried that the lessons that society could have and should have been learning over the last 6, 9, 12 months or so really are not being learnt. And as a consequence, I'm very concerned, ladies and gentlemen, that 3, 4, 5 years from now, we'll look back at this time and we'll realize that we didn't collectively, society as a whole around the world, failed to take the opportunity to challenge ourselves, to say, this is not good enough. We ought to make things better. We're not demanding it sufficiently. And we're going to look back and think, what a terrible, terrible, terrible missed opportunity. So the purpose for tonight's session is to try to galvanize support that we really ought to demand better things of ourselves and each other, better things of the financial industry, better things of all industry, and to do our utmost to build back better. That's so important to me. I'm going to park it there, and what I'm going to do now is invite our first round of speakers who are going to be working together. So we've got Agnes, we've got Monica and Justin, who are all sharing their session for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so to talk to us about their thoughts on the topic of building back better and what they can contribute to the conversation by way of the research that they have been carrying out, which is very, very interesting indeed. So can I please invite everybody to put your hands together and welcome our first round of speakers. Thank you very, very much indeed. And Monica and your team, can you please take the floor, and over to you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you perfectly well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, first of all, Andy, for giving us this opportunity to present our work. My name is Agnieszka Trzeciakiewicz, and together with my colleagues, Justin Chircop of Lancaster University and Monika Tarsalewska of University of Exeter, we will present our research paper, which is entitled CEO Risk-Taking, Incentives and Workplace Misconduct. So even though building back better idea of Andy is really focused on financial sector, our research is based on corporations, but I'm guessing the lessons learned from our research would be equally applicable to the idea of building a better future. Okay, so the International Labour Organization estimates that on average $2.8 trillion is lost due to the workplace misconduct, which includes health and safety violations, non-compliance with labor laws, or other violations that are broadly related to labor exploitation. So while these serious violations affect, as we know, well-being of employees and pose such a significant cost to the economy, there is very little known about why does it happen? What is the determinant? What are the determinants of these decisions? What are the mechanisms that actually trigger these misconducts? So in order to understand our research, the key thing to understand is that managerial compensation, so the way directors are paid, is set to motivate them to pursue maximization of shareholders' wealth. They are compensated, they are incentivized to take actions that will generate the greatest possible return. And the way they are paid, managers of stock-listed companies, they are market-listed companies, they are paid in cash, which is to some extent fixed, and with equity, which depends on the market value. And the great thing about market value and financial markets overall is that it provides an instantaneous feedback to firm actions, to managerial actions. So if managers do something good, if they announce very good news, market prices provides feedback by adjusting the share price and therefore adjusting managerial compensation. So if managers do well, if markets are satisfied, then their compensation is getting larger. So this is really this equity part of the compensation that is the key incentive mechanisms that provide managers with motivation to act in the best interest of shareholders, meaning to maximize their wealth. Okay, so to maximize the salary, these executives need to take risks to maximize rewards reflected by market value. But the type of risk they choose to increase the risk varies, of course. And you may be guessing, where am I going? I will be really talking about risk related to workplace misconduct. So what do we do in our research? Well, we consider if executive pay, so managerial pay, incentivizes CEOs to take risk to the extent that they will violate labor laws. And existing research shows that these risk-taking incentives encourage CEOs to undertake various risky decisions, but mostly investment decisions and financial decisions, okay? So this is what exactly these incentives are designed for. The most desirable outcome for incentives is engagement in more risky projects that would bring long-term returns. Okay. However, we expect that CEOs will take also risky decisions when it comes to managing workplace. And these decisions can then potentially result in workplace misconduct, which can be captured by labor law violations, labor exploitation, etc. So why do we have such an expectation, you might be asking? So, well, as financial economists, we see trade-off driving each and every decision. And here we believe that the penalties firms get for violating labor laws are too small to offset performance increase resulting from the misconduct. So let's take it step by step. So what the research tells us? So far, there is very little that we know on whether there are mechanisms operating within finance, accounting, or management practices that affect workplace misconduct. And one of the key papers is showing that actually investors or analysts can create a pressure on firms which causes workforce safety, which causes compromise on workforce safety. So managers, if they want to meet analysts' forecasts, market analysts' forecasts, they can compromise on workforce safety and well-being of their employees. So that's in one of the key papers in the field. Another key paper shows that managers can increase misconduct when they are pressured by on-site visits by senior management. And in our paper, we show that CEOs with higher risk-taking incentives are more likely to engage in the workplace misconduct. So how do we measure to what extent these equity incentives incentivize risk-taking is the next question. So in order to understand that, of course, I said that equity incentives, as you, I hope you remember, equity incentives include shares and options, but in our research, we concentrate on options. So we concentrate on firms which pay managers with options. In particular, we look at the CEOs. So what are these share options? These share options give CEOs a right to buy shares at a fixed price some period in time in the future within a company. So once the option is exercised, meaning a CEO purchases the share, he can keep it, okay? Or if the market price at the moment is higher than what he purchased it for, he can sell the share at a profit. And these options, these financial derivatives are, of course, having a value, right? We can value them. We can put a number on how much they are worth. And the price of an option depends on three things. It depends on price of a stock. It depends on volatility of this stock and time to maturity of the option. And we've got in finance quite a few very nice measures that enable us to distinguish with respect to changes to what managerial compensation increases. And the best proxy that we have in order to determine if managerial actions cause greater risk or whether the wealth responds to greater risk is VIGA. So I'm not going to go into the details as to how the VIGA is constructed, but what I would like you to understand is that our measure captures how managerial wealth changes with 1% change in the volatility, okay? And we expect that CEOs with greater risk-taking incentives are more likely to engage in workplace misconduct because it increases stock price volatility. Okay, and on this note, let me just pass the voice to my colleague Justin, who will explain our methodology and our data and show you our results. Justin, it's over to you.
Perfect, thanks, Agnieszka. So Agnieszka will kindly still control all the slides, so I will be, as soon as I finish one slide, Agnieszka kindly move to the following slide. So yeah, I mean, I will be taking the back end of our paper where we're talking about our empirical analysis. And the first thing is our data sources. So we use Compustat, which is a US database, which basically tracks listed companies, US listed companies, and it has fundamental data about companies. We use Violation Tracker, and Violation Tracker in this kind of research was really a game changer because Violation Tracker basically aggregates violations from different regulatory agencies. It has also information about the penalties levied against companies, and everything is in one database, and we can use this database basically to see what type of violations company were accused of, and what type of violations actually penalties were levied against companies. So Violation Tracker was very important for this research. Without it, we couldn't have done this research. So besides Violation Tracker, we use also Execocomp, and Execocomp is again, it's a US database which basically has information about executive compensation for the executives of the companies, of listed companies. And we use the CRISP, which is basically a database which has information about market performance of companies. So it has share prices and volume of companies. Our sample consists basically of manufacturing companies. So we follow prior literature, and prior literature was very much restricted about the type of violations they could capture. So in this draft of the paper, we focus, similar to prior literature, on manufacturing companies. However, we are currently revising the paper, and we are going to take advantage of the coverage of Violation Tracker, and we're extending our research also to other industries, which also might be subject to regulatory action. The number of observations we have on our sample is 14,865. Now we go to the descriptive statistics. So our sample consists of all those firms, of all those manufacturing firms for which we could calculate VIGA, which is our variable of interest. Obviously, those firms which do not feature in the Violation Tracker database are assumed not to have any violation in that particular period. So we're taking advantage of the fact that the Violation Tracker is comprehensive in terms of observations, and we're taking advantage of the fact that Violation Tracker aggregates data from different regulatory agencies. So any firm which doesn't feature in Violation Tracker is assumed not to have had any violation in that particular period. Just looking at violations and penalties, which are our two dependent variables, if you look at violations, so our average firm in our sample has 0.4 violations. So basically in 2 years, it will have 1 violation approximately. And as regards penalties, basically each firm, the average firm in our sample, has penalties of $141,000. If you look at the median, these mean figures might appear very small. And this is basically driven by the fact that most of our sample, more than 50% of our sample, has 0 violations. And this, I think, is important because it suggests that in our sample, there are certain firms, so most firms wouldn't be violators, but then there are certain firms which are multiple violators, which tend to violate regulations repeatedly. And that's basically driving our mean observations. As regards Vega, and Vega is our main independent variable of interest, then we control for a set of variables which prior literature has shown to be associated with violation. We move to the next slide. So this is basically our baseline result. So here basically we have Vega, which is our independent variable of interest, and we find that Vega is positively related to the number of violations, the logged number of violations, and also the logged value of the penalties. So in regression 1, we have the positive relation between risk-taking and the incentive to take risk, which is being captured by Vega, and the number of violations. In regression 2, we have the incentive to take risk, again captured by Vega, the incentive to take risk in the compensation structure of our executives, and the value of penalties. So this suggests that when you have incentives to take risk in the compensation structure of executives, one of the risks that these executives will take is with respect to labor violations. And there is higher labor violations in terms of both in absolute terms, but also in the value of the penalties levied against firms when there are greater incentives to take risk. Again, we have the controls. I talked about it before. So we have firm size, employees, and so on. We have also in this regression firm fixed effects and year fixed effects, and this is to ensure that our result is basically being driven by Vega, and we don't have a correlated omitted variable which is driving our results. Now, a question one might ask is, when is this link, this positive relation between risk-taking incentives and violations, labor violations in particular, more pronounced? And we have two scenarios, two instances, when we feel that this relation between Vega and violations will be most pronounced. The first is when there is a reduction in health and safety related expenditure. So when there is a reduction in health and safety expenditure, we expect that the relation between Vega and violations will be larger. And the second is when there is undue pressure on employees to perform. So when basically management asks, puts undue pressure on its employees to perform, typically either because there are some profit targets that need to be achieved, and or so on. In the first cross-sectional analysis, we examine what is the effect when there is a reduction in health and safety expenditure. So we proxy the reduction in health and safety expenditure using abnormal discretionary expenditures. And basically we find that when there is a reduction in abnormal discretionary expenditures, and remember we're using this as a proxy for health and safety expenditure, Vega, the relation between Vega and violations is most pronounced. And in fact, you'll find the interaction between Vega and absolute reduction in absolutely discretionary expenditure. To proxy for pressure, we use layoffs. So we basically see which companies laid off employees in the past year, and basically we use that as a proxy for the pressure management puts on employees to perform. So we say that those companies which lay off employees probably are those companies which are under pressure, and those companies for which management will require its employees to perform more. Now, we again interact our proxy for layoffs, and we capture that using high layoffs. We interact it with Vega, and we'll find some evidence. In this case, it's weak evidence that when there's undue pressure on employees, then the relation between Vega and the violations is higher. The next slide probably is the slide that we least expected we find this result. So here what we do is we have performance, basically it's return on assets as our dependent variable, and we put our violation metrics as our independent variables. And we see whether it actually pays off for CEOs to undertake or to to have violations. And what we find is that actually those companies which have greater violations actually are the companies which perform best. And this suggests that the penalties that these companies get for violating labor laws is not enough to tend the performance or to reduce the performance of companies. So basically what we find is those companies which have the higher number of violations and the higher number of higher penalties actually have higher performance. And this suggests that the benefits of workplace misconduct outweigh the negative consequences of workplace violations. Again, this is the result which was most surprising for us, because it seems to suggest that actually violations, at least in our sample period, pay CEOs because actually they result in greater performance. So just to conclude, so we examined the relation between CEO risk-taking incentives as embedded in equity options and workplace misconduct. And we find that risk-taking incentives result in a higher number of violations and also a greater amount of penalties. These results are most pronounced for firms which have cuts or which cut their health and safety expenditure, and also those firms which are most under pressure. The policy implication of this paper seems to suggest that penalties imposed by regulators seems not to be enough to discourage the activities of executives that result from the incentives in their compensation plans. Again, this is research which we are currently revising, and what we are trying to do now is to take advantage of the coverage of Violation Tracker and extend our analysis to more industries in the US and different types of violation. So thanks for this opportunity. I mean, if there are any questions, feel free.
Thank you very much indeed, Justin and Monica and Agnes. It's wonderful to have that data. My very simple, probably overly simplistic conclusion from that is, unfortunately, and this is not how we want it to be, but unfortunately, it pays chief execs to take unjustified risk because they'll probably do well out of it personally, even though others may suffer. Is that a very, I know it's oversimplified perhaps, but is that essentially what the data is telling us?
Totally agree. Yeah, Andy, that is what the data, at least that we have analyzed, seems to suggest.
And leading on from that, how much of the problem is it that we've got the party making the decision to take unjustified risk as the chief exec, but it's not the chief exec who pays the price of the fine or the penalty? There's a lack of personal accountability in the system. What would you say to that in very general terms?
Exactly. So for most industries, I mean, Ian Taylor, I think, makes a point in the chat that for certain industries, actually, there are incentives related to the number of deaths and serious injuries suffered by a particular company. But in other industries, I mean, here we use manufacturing industries, where probably there isn't so much, maybe that might not be as common as in the mining industry, or health and safety typically might be given less important than the mining industry. There is missing this link between executive compensation and labor well-being, in a sense.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Let's throw it open for questions and comments from others. Please just raise your hand either digitally or literally if you would like to make a point. And we can put your questions to Agnes and Justin and also Monica. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make a point. I'm going to go to Martin White. Martin, could I please invite you to elaborate on the point that you've just put in the chat? You say, if you pay execs in share options, what you get is not at all surprising. Please elaborate on that. I think I know where you're going with it, but please elaborate. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Perfectly well, yes, sir.
Lovely,
Thank you.
lovely. Thanks for the presentation. This has been a concern of mine for so long. When you give somebody share options, you give them a share in the upside and no share in the downside. The other thing is they tend to be in a relatively short period. So that upside and downside has a short time scale. But even if they were long-term options, they would still be egregious, because it's the extreme case of the limited liability put option, which ordinary shares represent. If you give executives the opportunity to make an absolute fortune, if they manage to engineer the share price to go up, then they walk away with that fortune. They don't care at all if the company is shot to bits. And a perfect example is the banking crisis, where everyone really was persuading themselves that they'd done much better than they really had. Massive bonuses were taken by the executives, and both the shareholders and the public purse walked off with a horrible problem. So the idea that you can incentivize people, or you should incentivize people on short-term measures and on measures that they can manipulate, is entirely wrong. But there's no quick and easy solution. If you give it to regulators, they'll make a mess of it. It needs to be deeply thought out. If you have certain kind of rules or principles, what will the consequences really be? And if you think things through, you often get unintended consequences. So it needs very deep and patient thought.
Thank you, Martin. That's a very clear elaboration. Could I go to Agnes and Justin and Monica to reflect on what Martin has just said? Does your data bear that out? What are your gut feels about whether this idea that paying people by way of share options is fundamentally flawed because you're likely to have exploitative behaviour by the chief execs, etc.? Agnes, Justin, Monica, who'd like to pick that one up?
So let me jump in. Yeah, thank you for this question. That's a very important point about short-termism in general in finance and industry. So this options that are given to CEOs are clearly to incentivize them to undertake risk for the company and create value, but basically, it's although it's creating value for the company, it's having a byproducts in the form of various misconduct. For example, it has been shown in the literature that that CEO options can even lead to corporate fraud. So, but like in our research, we showed that it's not only about manipulations in financial statements, but they can clearly have impact on various stakeholders. So, so one way would be to actually engage other stakeholders in the like to have some impact on the value of the company, not only the CEOs. So so there are also like given various options to employees, but probably another, not maybe a clear solution, would be to make the CEO compensation less sensitive to performance and more sensitive to the goals of stakeholders, or that one of them can be like their well-being as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make a point at this stage or ask a question. Kim Schweitzer, Kim, please take the moment to introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you, Kim.
Hi there, I'm Kim Schweitzer. I'm an ambassador and volunteer for TTF and consultant and founder of Time for Change London, and have a background in executive compensation, M&A, and total rewards. And I guess my question is this, that are you planning on extending your research beyond stock options and share options and going into other types of equity and performance share models, because I think that would be interesting too, especially because much of that also shows, as Martin White said, sharing of the upside and not in the downside.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you. Lovely, well-phrased question. Monica, Justin, Agnes, who'd like to pick up on that point? Thank you.
Yeah, I can pick it up. I mean, it would surely be interesting to study other types of compensation which are common in various industries. Obviously, our limitation is obviously data availability. So as long as data on time series data on a cross section of firms is available, would truly be interesting in examining examining the effect of different types of compensation on the behavior of executives. I mean, I take also the opportunity to comment on Martin's comment before. I totally agree that obviously short-termism and executive compensation tends to, in a sense, promote short-termism. Obviously, the key is what are the vesting conditions associated with that equity, with those call options, essentially. So the key is, obviously, one needs to be very careful what vesting conditions management needs to satisfy, so as actually those options will vest on management. Obviously, these vesting conditions, I mean, ideally, these are set by an independent body, right? These vesting conditions. And typically there is the remuneration committee, which sets these vesting conditions. But obviously, the more long-term these vesting conditions are, probably the better it is for all stakeholders related to the company.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I've just put into the chat the pretty famous Charlie Munger quote. I'm sure you've all heard it before. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And essentially what he's saying, of course, is that people will perform according to how they're being incentivized to perform. So I guess that whilst we could look at this from an, if you like, moralistic point of view, a chief exec could justify to himself that his job is to, work his contract as effectively as possible. If he's incentivized to take short-term risks, to bump up the share price, and if that earns him or her a tremendous bonus, then so be it. It's not his fault that the contract's designed that way. That's kind of the thought that could be argued back, I suppose. My question, not just to Justin and Agnes and Monica, but anybody else, has anybody seen any changes over the last year and a half or so since the pandemic to try to bring about changes in the incentives of organizations and leaders in the C-suite in companies to reflect this notion of trying to do things better in the future? Has anybody seen any evidence of that, or indeed any evidence of the contrary, whereby there is no change? Just wave your hand if you'd like to make a point to that point. Mr. Martin White, back to you.
Well, sorry to keep coming in. I think if you look at where the incentives really come from, who really controls companies now? And I think it's to do with the incentives that are felt by fund managers. Fund managers feel themselves. They don't feel too bad. And I can't see us changing that, if you like, base of power through other than, let's call it, non-conventional.
Thank you, Martin. We're losing your connection a little bit, Martin, but I think we've got the gist of that. Thank you very much. So let me put this question a different way. We'll go to Anne-Marie in a moment. Then after Anne-Marie's made a point, I'd like anybody to share their thoughts on what kind of incentive structure is needed for leaders of organizations to lead those organizations in a way that's going to better serve society. Perhaps amongst you have some ideas. Anne-Marie Borg, first of all. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Yes, I'm Anne-Marie Borg. I have a project called the Antara project, which is about focusing on the education system. And I think I have seen changes, but not necessarily in the financial sector. I see changes because the younger generation is changing and understanding a lot more what the whole system is about. And I think it's what we're looking at is the chicken and the egg. What comes first, the financial sector or our society? What leads the other? And I think at the moment we're in a position where actually the financial sector and money leads our society. And that's where maybe the changes need to actually be focused. And I can only see that happening with the education system changing and the new generation with a fresh outlook. That's what I can see.
Thank you very much indeed. So maybe, if you're right, Anne-Marie, the young generation coming through is going to drive the change that our generation ought to be, but isn't.
Well, we can lay the foundations for it, and we need to do that. It's this cathedral thinking again. We need to actually look to the future, put the foundations down, which is what TTF is trying to do very much. And I think I'm trying to do also with the Antara project, try and change the format that we have.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So let's go back to that point I made before Anne-Marie spoke, this idea of, you know, what kind of incentive structures are needed to drive the right kind of decision making in the boardroom that creates the right kind of corporate culture that in turn drives the right kind of behavior. What would be needed there? Any thoughts, folks? I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see your hands. Agnes, lovely to hear from you. Back to you, Agnes.
Well, I just wanted to jump in as to I really in the meantime checked whether my recollection is correct, but indeed maybe not after the pandemic as you Andy indicate, but right after the business roundtable that was in August 2019. There have been changes on the market. I'm not sure if you are all familiar with what business roundtable was, but this was basically a meeting by top executives of corporations in the US got together in August 2019, and they have announced that they will commit themselves to change the main aim of a business from shareholders' wealth maximization to concentration on stakeholders, right? And researchers as myself probably concentrated more on this event as a breakthrough and as a moment ever since some changes started being implemented. And I've seen one paper, but I cannot send you a reference. I would have to dig it up a little bit more carefully. But I've seen that out of top US businesses, after this roundtable took place, I think 40% of them started implementing what we call ESG factors into executive compensation. So the compensation is then set on not only stock market performance, but also on the basis of their environmental, social, and governance practices. The problem with this is, of course, that it still requires a lot of research because we do not have a standard way of measuring such a practice, because we have, you know, we talk about violation tracker. In our research, we use very reliable thing that already happened, right? If firms violated, they have done something really, really bad. We've got penalties, we've got court cases to support our research. But in terms of incentivizing managers, there is indeed a trend to implement this ESG factor into a compensation package. However, the research still says that the proxies that are being used are to be improved. So that's my input into the discussion. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you very much. And I've put a couple of things into the chat relating to this point. One is the original announcement, and more recently some kind of skeptical assessment about whether the announcement back in 2019 has led to any real meaningful change. But I agree, it's most definitely a step in the right direction. Does anybody have anything for Agnes or Monica or Justin before we move to our next speaker? Just wave your hand at me if you'd like to say something. Mr. Nigel, forgive me, let me go to Nigel Keynes, then we'll go to Monica. Nigel, to you first. Nigel.
Good evening. General question: isn't part of the problem that when firms are looking for their superstar new CEO or high-profile people to go on their board, they often want a big, well-known name to enhance the image of the company, and it puts the prospective CEOs in a position where they can say, well, okay, I'll come and work for your company, but I want to negotiate my own performance incentives before I agree to work for the company. And I think in many cases, there's clear evidence that people negotiate extremely advantageous and short-term ways of exploiting the firms for their own benefits right from the very outset. So the whole idea is taken away completely from the board members, perhaps scrutinizing in detail what those incentive conditions should be, although obviously they would have a say. But I think in practice, this is a huge problem.
Nigel, such an interesting point. Agnes, Monica, Justin, would one of you like to pick up on that? And then we'll go to Monica for her final point. Thank you.
So just to maybe comment on that. So the problem is at the industry level, because of course the firms want to attract the talent and the best, and they want to offer the right working conditions, but CEOs always want more and more and more and more and more. So there is no limit really to the flexibility the firms can have, or the cap on the salaries, and we saw that, like excessive bonuses, even during the crisis. So there's never no limit on such behavior. Whether there should be regulators stepping in and actually establishing some rules, that's always a troubling question. And what I also wanted to comment on is like linking the CEO compensation to ECGs. It's a great idea to incorporate the stakeholders' goals, and even now the theme in what we teach in finance changes, because we used to we still do that. We still teach that the purpose of the company is to maximize shareholders' wealth. And now the books that are appearing for students even are more about are shifting towards maximizing stakeholders' wealth. That was kind of a purpose of the company. It was used to a purpose of the company, like Anglo-Saxon system. But now the companies are using this ECG term rather for greenwashing, or for branding, for marketing, or for being like recognized better, rather than what its purpose is. So it's we as researchers can only kind of check that whether these goals are actually kind of put into practice.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. There's a bit of background noise. Can we please all show our appreciation to Justin and Monica and Agnes for their research and the presentation of that research. I think the conclusions that you share are actually rather worrying, because they really do show that it pays to take inappropriate risks for the short-term benefit of the chief execs. Thank you very, very much indeed for your session. That was great research, and please do use the chat to circulate it. We're now going to go to Dr. Sharam Alijani very quickly, who's going to be off to another engagement shortly. So Dr. Alijani, please introduce yourself, and over to you to share your thoughts. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me okay, Andy?
Perfectly well, sir. Perfectly well.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and, of course, the presence of our colleagues honorable colleagues in the very interesting research area that I was listening very carefully. Unfortunately, as I mentioned to you, there's a time zone difference. I have to be in another meeting with the New York office, and I can't be here because I was expecting to be able to come in a bit earlier. But obviously, with all my interest in this topic and the work you're doing, Andy, with other colleagues also, I would like to be able to continue our conversation. If you don't mind, I would like to just share very briefly with you my area of research and what we do. And the point that I brought up, of course, we don't have that much time. I have to wrap up in less than 10 minutes to be able to join the other session, 2 p.m. New York time. The topic I'm working on very much with my colleagues and co-authors in the area, it's on the area of governance, and more specifically, sustainability and governance of the common good. And corporation is recently one of the areas that I've been focusing on as a center for promoting the common good. And of course, again, I don't have much time, unfortunately, to really go into this, but I hope we will have the opportunity, and I can make these slides available at for some further discussion. Now, I don't want to get into so much history of governance, but obviously in Greek, kupernan and governance means essentially metaphorically how Plato designated the governing of, the idea of governance, but that idea of governance was the idea of governing the people. And in medieval France, where I most of the time happen to be, is governance referred to government because they use the word gouvernance as government. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, the term was used later to mean something else, designate the art of and manner of governing. The problem is in management sciences or studies, where governance has been taken to mean what I call a hodgepodge of principles, processes, and systems by which organizations are to be governed, and of course, for the benefit of stakeholders. So here we have a problem because the domain of governance is getting a bit diluted, and of course, we have a bit of a problem. Some of the issues you referred to in terms of salaries and bonuses and the things that we basically get confronted with as problems that corporations generate and create is related to this understanding of governance. So the model that we're working on is very much based, I don't want to get into theory so much because of lack of time. Obviously, the idea is the difficulty of reconciling individual preferences and what the governance of individual interest is with that of the social choices, what I call collective choices. Now, we do have a very big, I would call it literature in the work that was conducted in the early 50s, mid 50s, 60s by Kenneth Arrow in terms of, the difficulty of reconciling the two. And obviously, there's a lot to say in that area. Unfortunately, I have to be very short. Now, that we have another problem when it comes to the issue of individual and social choices and preferences, and that's the idea that we've introduced in economics. I was trained as an economist, engineer, and economist. Utilitarians, Marshall, Bentham, Pigou, who basically considered social individual welfare mattered the most, and the economist's main goals consisted of fostering social goodness, but it wasn't very much clear what it means when it comes on the one side to protect individual welfare and the benefits, and on the other side, social goodness. Here we have a bit of issue that we have to address. Social opportunities are usually, in general, arrangements for everyone, for the society that makes, the benefits, basically arrangement that society makes. And for the purpose of what I call a superior good, that obviously is considered to be good, such as education, healthcare, and of course, all the things that we believe is important, essential to the benefit development of society. Now, we don't, again, have the time, but I'd like to very much refer to John Rawls' definition of primary goods, goods that every rational man is presumed to desire, that raises the question of the means by which the society can pursue that superior human goals. And of course, when it comes into governance, we need to consider that as a way of achieving those goals, and not only some what I call goals by just a few. The other question that we address here in just terms of dilemmas, but one of the problems of this dilemma issue is the way corporations are being, the attitude of corporations, corporate managers, I would call them eventually in some cases shareholders that are behind the system of corporations, and the way institutions and corporations have to interact. And that's why our research, my research and my colleagues' research is primarily on the role of institutions in rectifying, if I could put it, repositioning, realigning this issue of governance. And we refer to the work that Ostrom, in particular, Eleanor Ostrom has conducted in her research in terms of police-centric governance. Obviously, here we discuss the role of actors, the purpose and objectives of corporations. After all, corporations outside of society are meaningless, and they need just to fulfill the superior goals for which the society is made and for which corporations are supposed to operate. And of course, the idea of performance and governance obviously becomes a very, very deep issue when it comes into assigning value to the role of corporations, measuring their performance in terms of eventually maybe, let's say, economic results, but also in terms of social impact. We do have obviously a difference and discrepancy. I have put this in a very short sort of format in which I look at corporations in terms of what they do, in terms of the way they do it, governance, and the common good that they have to achieve at the top of the pyramid. It is about public engagement. It's about public knowledge. It's about a way to bring institutions to regulate, control the work organizations do, in particular corporations, because obviously, again, in a world in which we're living, corporations seem to have taken a position which is not always in the benefit. Of course, we do have now a debate about corporate social responsibility, basically values that we refer to as environmental, social values. These are good things. These are recent developments, but we still got a long way to go. So just to make my presentation short, the work we are doing, it's about corporate governance conundrum, how a single board committee decision-making center can eventually be formed, how we can make sure that the property rights, the copyrights, issues that are very important for our economic development and social system are properly put in place, and how behind the benefit is social and not only for some individuals. Problems of hierarchies becomes an issue. Society in general tends to be very much thinking in terms of a top-down approach, control. And of course, in reality, when we go into system thinking and look at the way nature is built and the way we interact within that, what I call natural ecosystem, it's the other way around. It's very much bottom up. And of course, the issues is also the way this is set within the corporate system. It seems to be very much under the system of what we call command, control, top down, and we haven't really got away with that. I mean, we're using still the tools and concepts of corporate activities that belong to almost 100 years ago. We're still teaching finance and business in many ways the way it was taught 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and we're in a totally different world today. Again, I want to be short. So there is debate that we basically try to look at the problems of hierarchy and the role that directors and of course boards should play to clarify their position, of course, again, for the betterment and purpose of society. We do obviously have a lot of work that we have done with our colleagues. And of course, I would like to share that with your team of researchers and eventually organization of some of the other future seminars or conferences. But we do have a plan. This is the way we will work with my colleague Shan Turnbull and some others, how we can think in terms of ecological governance, what Ostrom looks at in terms of common pool resources in the nature. Why we have to take care of some natural resources, we should apply it to the principle of governance within the corporation. For us, a corporation, for me, is a common pool resource. And of course, it becomes therefore a common good for which not only the shareholders, not only the employees and the stakeholders, but the entire society has to obviously interact and develop a plan. That was pretty much, Andy, my point. I'd like to bring to an end because I really have to run. And I know there are questions and comments. I would have loved to be able to continue this conversation with you. And I really do apologize, but there was a time zone confusion for me. I thought I would be coming in a bit earlier. But anyways, this is it. And of course, we would like to take it. We do have a series of conferences, organization. A book will be coming out soon on the common corporations as common good. And I would like to share it very much with the work you're doing in your fine institution, system of, whatever that you call it, think tank, transparency. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today, especially given the time zone considerations and the session we've had so far. Thank you so much. Can we please all, as quickly as possible, show our appreciation to Dr. Alijani before he needs to zoom off to somewhere else. So thank you very much indeed. That's wonderful. We know that we know that this theme of polycentric governance keeps coming up. We're becoming increasingly familiar with your work, sir, and also the work of Shan Turnbull, who you mentioned as well in your talk. So we're very, very grateful for you to spend some time with us.
And once again, my apologies to all the, those who present tonight, but I will be very happy to be able to continue our conversation. Thank you, Andy, for the opportunity. I wish you all, and of course, I will come back to you with maybe more on this as soon as we get a chance to talk again. Thank you, and my apologies.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll gladly have you back. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Let's go straight to Nick Silver. Nick, over to you, sir. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks so much, Andy, for asking me to speak here. And can you hear me okay, by the way?
Perfectly well, yeah. And to take the time to introduce yourself and give us some background and context, Nick.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's great to be here with old friends. I'm glad to see my old friend Martin here, who's taking a break from his sailing. And I apologise, Martin, because I'm going to give a slightly similar talk in a couple of weeks, which will probably go. So Nick Silver, by background, I'm an actuary. And I'm a slightly heretical actuary. I wrote a book called Finance, Society and Sustainability. I set up chairman of Climate Bonds Initiative and also a Radix think tank or Radical Centre. So I was just, I think I'll quickly go on to my talk because hopefully more interesting than me. And I'm going to start with what I call a new paradigm in finance. And I can hear you all groaning, not someone else talking about a new paradigm. And is that a totally meaningless thing to talk about? Well, actually, if you go back to the original Thomas Kuhn and what he said about paradigms, I think it's quite a useful framework, even if it's become a bit of a cliche. And the reason why I think it's useful is because we talk about a new paradigm, new framework, then we think about looking to what a new paradigm could look like, rather than trying to improve our current system, which I entirely agree with everything that's been said about how dysfunctional it is. And I kind of like to look at it, what we have now as a sort of legacy, which we need to run off with the least damage. And that seems, I don't want to be too optimistic there, because if you shift to another sort of system, it might not, there's no guarantee it's going to be any better. But it does give you an opportunity in the transition. It gives an opportunity to guide the way it goes and hopefully incorporate some sort of better features. Right. So why a new paradigm? What paradigm do we have currently? Well, it's not so obvious. So the classic example of a new paradigm is the geocentric going towards a heliocentric with Galileo. Right, and that's you've got one word there. It's like obvious. The universe used to go around the Earth, and then it actually goes around the sun. But what we have is not so obviously defined. I try to put it in a few words as possible. And what I think I've come up with the following, and it's so clunky, it's terrible. So our current paradigm is that capital decision making is delegated to mostly privately owned oligopolies via regulated markets on the basis of optimizing short time scale risk return decisions, and this brings about socially beneficial outcomes. Now, the socially beneficial outcomes are actually a bit vague, and it's more a case of this is what will happen. It's the faith in the sort of market, or the way this market works, will bring about different socially beneficial outcomes. So if you talk to actuaries who deal in pensions, their socially beneficial outcome is the security of the pensioners in their DB schemes, but the sort of I can't remember his name, the Greenspan socially beneficial outcome is the market is best in all worlds and gives us paying most institutions. So that's kind of the paradigm we're at. But actually, Mark Carney put it better than me. He summarized it as the 3 R's: reporting, risk, and return. And actually, interestingly, he was talking about a kind of almost like a new paradigm, but he said that the 3 R's is a good way of operating. That's the way finance operates, right? But to support this paradigm, there's a whole complex of stuff, which is like intellectual ideas, there's a kind of the power of the USA, the global hegemon backing this, and with the IMF, which was slightly in their pocket. There are a bunch of regulators, institutions, sort of a whole intellectual framework, and the institutions including kind of big investment banks and central banks, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so and the thing is, this like change in paradigm seems to be that's kind of like is that really feasible? Well, just looking back 100 years, we've actually had two shifts in paradigm in finance. There's one in the we had a very similar to what we have now, laissez-faire capitalism, before and after the First World War, really, and that ended really the Wall Street crash. It hung over after it and was replaced by a kind of managed capitalism, corporatism, which we had in the beginning just before the Second World War, then during the war, and in its immediate aftermath, which was actually the greatest period of prosperity and where all the kind of big Western economies grew the most, and with a widespread sharing of prosperity. And then after the abandonment of gold standard by Nixon in '71, kind of ushered in the era we have now of financial capitalism. That's so. And if you go back 100 years previously, you'd have seen pretty similar like stuff. So it's kind of more unusual to have a way we do finance staying on indefinitely. You can expect it to change rapidly. So Andy, can I unshare that screen? Can you do that for me?
Yeah, sure. So
okay, great. So you can see my face again instead.
Yes.
But, okay, so I'm saying that it's kind of likely. So why would this? We've got this paradigm, this 3 R's, and it's backed by those stuff. So why might that be changing? Well, it's changing. Actually, the main change I see is that the paradigm had to be backed by a big power, which was USA and the IMF willing to its bidding. And that we're no longer in that sort of world. I mean, we're a multipolar world. The emergent power is Chinese, which calls itself communist. They don't do, why should they follow the US system? The countries which have escaped this, like Sweden, are wealthy in filling the gaps. The USA has really imposed its kind of financial economics on the rest of the world. The political, even within the Western countries, the political narratives change. We're no longer we're talking about building back better, going to net zero. We're not talking about maximizing utilities, etc., etc. The intellectual backing of this system, like financial economics, has been shown to be flawed. It's loads of holes being poked in it. There is a potential alternative. We've got the emergence of other countries. So it's no longer big investment banks are no longer the big guys in town. It's now big tech. We've got digital currency coming, which could disintermediate banks. The big players are changing, and so it's unlikely that there's no reason to expect that this system will continue. And the main reason actually is it's not working. It's not delivering pensions, it's not delivering housing markets, a disaster. Everything that finance is involved in is not working. But I want to actually just concentrate on one, which is a kind of internal challenge to the current paradigm, which we mentioned before, which is the ESG and the drive to net zero. So when I started out this, most of my career, ESG was this marginal activity. You had to be slightly apologetic to justify its existence. But now everyone's ESG, BlackRock, Vanguard, all the big players saying we're green, we're going net zero, right? And this change in the market by practitioners has also induced a change in regulators, and it's backed by governments and central banks. Central banks are greening themselves and intervening to push towards net zero too. If you look at this, if you look at why this is, the big investment companies are making a promise to investors. They're saying we're ESG and you should buy ESG. And the promise to investors is kind of twofold, which is both explicit and implicit. Like the first one is that ESG captures non-financial risk. So if you invest in ESG, your risk return will do better because we're analyzing this non-financial risk, which therefore you'll do better. And the second claim is that you, by investing in ESG, you're making money whilst doing good, like you're doing some kind of social benefit. Both of these are flawed. The first is totally flawed, because ESG is, if you're kind of totally amoral and just looking at a risk perspective, ESG only captures a certain number of the non-financial risks. So for example, I'm just giving a ridiculous example here. So say you invest in, green, whatever, because your theory is that the theory of why this will manifest itself is the world will go to net zero. And so if you're holding brown, you'll get hit, right? And therefore it's more risky. But what if Trump gets to power in the USA? Well, and he reverses everything, then you're not dealing with the risk of Trump getting into power. So you should, I don't know, be giving money to the Republican Party or whatever to mitigating your risk. So it's clearly not a risk, it's only a looking at certain risks, right? And the second claim that you're making money whilst doing good is also dubious, because at the margin it does do some good. So for example, it's very hard for increasingly hard for coal companies to raise finance. But what you're essentially doing, if you're an investor, is you're buying secondary claims on future cash flows. You're not really doing good compared to what you could do, given how big ESG now is. So when ESG used to be a marginal player, you own 1% of the market or 0.5% of the market, there's only a limited amount that you can do. But if you're combined with other ESG investors own the majority of the market, you actually have a huge amount of power which you're not using, and therefore in not using it, you're actually not really doing as much as you could be. You should be going to some kind of very forceful stewardship model. If you wanted to go net zero, best thing you could do is buy up Exxon and shut it down, right? That would be doing good, but I don't think anyone's talking about doing that. So and there's a big difference between having a zero emissions portfolio and the world moving to net zero, right? Because if you just shift your investments into things like Microsoft, which don't give up much emissions, you still leaving all the brown assets, which are not. So I know there is some movement in that direction, but it's much smaller than needs to be, right? So what I've described is a situation where people who are selling ESG funds are managing people's money whilst they're making false claims. They're making false claims about risk management. They're making false claims about the money you invested us is doing good. So I think the term for managing money whilst making false claims is something like mis-selling. Is that correct? Right. So sorry to be a bit controversial there. But this is my cynicism about ESG. But on the other hand, what the rise of ESG has done is it's broken the financial economic paradigm. Under the old paradigm, the likes of BlackRock and Goldman Sachs would be, very much in line with, we've got efficient markets, etc. There's CAPM and stuff. But you're now junking that. You're now saying, actually, there are these extra financial risks. We're trying to do good with our money. So the practitioners are actually saying the old model is broken, and their kind of current situation of the dominance of ESG is it's not a new paradigm. It's a halfway point. It's a non-stable equilibrium, but because if you're selling, if you're mis-selling stuff, someone's going to take you to court eventually, and therefore you won't be able to continue doing that. And so we need to go to a different position. The different position could be moving back to the old way, but I don't think that will happen. And so the kind of logic of ESG within the financial system actually undermines its kind of own way it operates. And also in the meantime, regulation has changed, and central banks, etc., are actually moving the market to another place. So what is this new paradigm that then might be moving it to? And there isn't really one. So I'd like to come up with a proposal. And what I'm saying isn't entirely original. I mean, like the last speaker said something quite similar. But I think going back to what I said at the beginning, it's not about making reasonably marginal changes. It's talking about the new overall framework. And I've sort of termed it wealth. So and what is wealth? So investment is often described as wealth management, and businesses create wealth. But in the past, what this means is a very narrow definition of what wealthy is, and based on sort of financial capital, right? So if you think of a country like Britain, Britain is described as a wealthy country still, although it's becoming diswealthy. Why is Britain wealthy? Well, there are many aspects to wealth. Again, this has been covered, but I've come up with 7. So there's social, and a lot of the stuff about the inequality and the left behind is, if you look at, this is what people are saying, it's about the loss of community, and the modern kind of version of that is social network, and the networks between people, the trust. There's informal networks and formal networks. There's like the formal networks, things like rule of law and lack of corruption, bringing trust. But there's this whole kind of bunch of stuff which is also called social capital. There's obviously natural wealth, the ecosphere and biodiversity. I actually came up with this while thinking about like nature-based solutions and biodiversity finance. So if you think about this, Brazil busy chopping down its rainforest, well, the wealth of Brazil, you can see, is the Amazon as part of the wealth of Brazil. So you can think of natural capital as wealth. Then there's like culture, knowledge, and know-how. I know Japan, for example, protects its people with specialist skills. And if you think of, you come to London, why is London wealthy? Well, it's got things like the National Gallery and the theatre. And there's but that's one aspect, the embodied knowledge of how to make things, etc. And then there's obviously health and resilience. With COVID highlighted health and resilience as became so well. And then sort of, as well as the obvious financial wealth is one aspect of wealth. There's the insights that are coming up from positive psychology, this new branch of psychology. So actually of what makes people happy and what and well-being, and that's things like all the other things that make up wealth, like social connection and being in nature and being kind to each other, which are all part of social capital. And so our measure of utility or happiness of GDP is a very narrow definition of happiness. But actually, the latest psychology is saying, well, happiness is or utility or well-being is actually the same as what we would consider this wider definition of wealth. And supporting these kind of wealth, you need social and physical infrastructure and social safety nets. And you also want, which finance often deals with, is finance and business, which create wealth, but not narrow financial wealth, creates the actual real wealth, like nature wealth and social things, right? Okay, so then we get to the argument which everyone's familiar with, Thomas Piketty. If you're not familiar with, there's 600, his first book, 600 pages, which really can all be summarized in one equation, which is R is bigger than G. So what this means, if you think back of my chart that I showed of 40 or 50 years of our kind of the financialization of the world, what's happened is that the financial capital has grown at the expense of other forms of capital or wealth. And because financial capital has grown disproportionately with these other financial forms of wealth, it can then capture the society or the body of power or the levers of power. And there's a brilliant book called The Meritocracy Trap by Daniel Markovits, which explains how this has happened. So this is a kind of, the paradigm we'd like to go to. And I've given a very vague overall framework, what the aim of finance, the purpose of finance. We talked previously in these discussions about the purpose of finance is the creation of wealth, but actually this much broader definition of wealth. But in practical terms, how do we do that? So, the actual basis case is actually socialism. But unfortunately, because if you think of, a lot of people would default to that. But actually, unfortunately, that doesn't work because we talked about things like social networks and distributed power, and socialism often gives you a very centralized power. It doesn't really tend to focus on community when the government does anything. It's easily captured by an elite, and often it's therefore prone to making arbitrary decisions. So instead of that, can we do better than socialism and what is the involvement of the state. And I'm getting to this because actually, Radix, my personal journey is I've gone from finance to actually politics, because it becomes a political decision. And the current settlement that we have, this current paradigm, is not some kind of free market. It's a created thing by governments. It's a political entity. It's the project, maybe of the US government, of the IMF. It's a kind of instrument of power, and power relations is politics, right? So you can't really avoid the politics. And I think in November, Radix and Transparency Task Force are doing a session on this. So on the one hand, it's like a big top-down, we need some kind of political settlement, but also there's the bottom-up, incrementally building the models that already exist. So have I talked too long? I'll just finish off quickly. Andy, how long have I got?
A couple of minutes would be great, please. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So there are already models that exist which we can build on, and so this sort of macro level, there are things like impact investment are emerging. There's VC EIS funds, so you're rather than you're getting this tax benefit for just specifically investing your money in something that is doing something directed to small startup companies. In this case, there's, in my background of green bonds, there's the use of proceeds bonds where the money that you invest goes straight to something that's green. And then there's entities like local government pension schemes, which are trying to get together to invest in local infrastructure. With the emergence of central bank digital currency, this presents a great opportunity for change. I'd say it's not necessarily good change, because it will disintermediate banks. Banks are these big institutions which support the kind of old paradigm. They're going to be kind of wiped out and new entities will emerge in their place. But in that pivotal moment, there's a chance to direct what happens with central bank digital currencies. I kind of believe in the UK we have this, we're going towards the CDC, and we've got this auto-enrollment. I think that's a mistake, because the Swedish pension model is actually a better system. I can go into why I think it's a better system, but if you introduce the Swedish model, and you probably don't know that, you might not know what that is, but I can go into that as well, with a twist. And the twist is that the Swedish model contains within these buffer funds, which you can give a social goal, and the social goal can be to create this wealth. Then we've got the whole of the pension system in the UK has this massive tax incentive. I've had arguments over years about people, but research has just come out recently where the tax incentive on pensions in the UK is worth 2% of GDP alone. And if you link that to wealth creation in this looser sense, then think how much good that could potentially do. And then I've got a few political things that we need to do, like devolution of power, give mayors, cities capital raising ability, have local development bank networks, have local banks of social goals like the Ecology Building Society. But they kind of, just to finish, the main problem here is actually, which the last speaker mentioned, was about measurements, because it's all very well coming up with this idea of wealth, and wealth being all these different things, but to give private sector, and you had this discussion about Charlie Munger and incentives, to give people incentives to invest in wealth, you need to be able to describe in terms where you can compensate people on what this wealth is. And I think we've always fallen short on this. There've been the SDGs, and there've been like the triple bottom line, and nothing's really worked. So I think we need to really put a big focus on how we measure stuff, but not like a pointless measurement, which I think is happening in ESG, but because we're actually going to use this measurement to create the wealth that we need. So I've got more to say, but I'll stop there because I've been talking far too long. So sorry about that. So thank you for listening to the patiently.
No, Nick, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts there. You covered so many different areas. It was quite incredible that you covered pretty much everything that ought to be covered. So that's really great. Can we please show our appreciation to Nick first of all? Then we'll go to some Q&A for him, and then we'll go to our final speaker, Mr. Brian Basham. So does anybody have anything they'd like to share with Nick in response to what he's been speaking about? Just wave your hand at me if you do. we'll go to Rebecca Self. Rebecca, we can't see you, but please fix that if you can. Thank you for doing so. Over to you, Rebecca.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you so much. It was super interesting, and I recognise a few of those thoughts and things you were speaking about. My question, so I've been talking to quite a few people in the industry, and a lot say, and this is in ESG investing and so on, a lot will say that the technology is there for specifically thinking of climate change, climate action, and these investments that are needed. A lot of the understanding and the science is there, but the conditions are not there at the moment and the right incentives. And I think you touched on tax and a few of these other types of incentives. And when I sort of probe into that in more detail, what a lot of experts say to me is, it's quite simple: introduce a carbon price, a carbon tax. And so, and once you have that price, and this is explicitly on the environment, then the rest will simply follow. So channeling those investments and so on. So I was just curious to get your take on that sort of carbon pricing, carbon tax.
Okay, well, I think the carbon tax is a good idea. And I think actually a tax and distribute is good because it will give you political kind of backing, because people just get money in their success. But it's kind of not enough, because it's not enough to, with the COVID and the the populist insurrections, what we're seeing is like loss of, what you ask people why, and it's like a loss of community and a loss of dignity and a leveling up agenda. And we know how to develop. There've been lots of development over years, and the latest kind of smart economics is about building networks and building food. And we're not, we need to. Sorry, I'm giving, that's kind of going in one direction, and the other direction is, if you think about like a saving system like pensions, people put aside money, and that the point of that is to create wealth for the country, but the wealth is defined in this narrow financial way, and the almost carbon is the tip of an iceberg. And we think of our tip, that's sorry, not like an analogy, destruction of biodiversity. Biodiversity is like a wealth. It's the wealth of humanity. The wealth of a nation is its biodiversity. But using this word wealth in a loose sense, and if a country or the world can generates wealth, it can look after its older people. That's what a pension system is doing. The moment it's not doing that, it's like the first talk about the kind of value destruction caused by the incentives within pension. It's eating itself. That those companies have to pay back their have to generate wealth to pay back their pensions, but what are they doing? They're abusing their staff, right? That's not that. Those are the people who live in the country who are generating the wealth. So we sort of step back and take it holistically. The answer is not easy, but that's the right direction. So just putting a carbon tax will keep everything in place, except we'll move to we might be able to do the same destruction with lower carbon. Right?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Rebecca. Anybody else for Nick before we move on to Brian? Wave something at me if you'd like to. Mr. Martin White. Martin.
Hi, I hope you can hear me this time.
Yes.
On the question of carbon tax and global warming, I very much, whilst I'm really, really concerned about all the issues that we're talking about here, I would regard the world's #1 priority as tackling global warming almost to the exclusion of everything else. So I would say if carbon tax will help there, it's good. The area I find most upsetting at the moment is there's a lot of talk about investors doing things, but in practice, nothing will happen unless governments actually make them happen.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Nick. Anybody else for Nick before we move on to hear from Brian? I think we're all good. So Nick, thank you very much indeed. Can we please once again show our appreciation to Nick for his session? Thank you very much indeed. And we'll now invite Mr. Brian Basham to take the stage, so to speak, and share with us what he'd like to say. Brian, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for inviting me to speak. It's gosh, you've assembled a clever bunch of people here. This secondary modern boy hardly understood a word of it all, but there we are. I'm doing my best. I'm sure I would have failed exams set by any of them. But look, as you know, I'm very keen to look at the issue you started with, really, which is the crookery expressed by the 333 billion of fines by the financial sector. That's disgraceful. I think you are guilty personally of a little naivety when you say that banks expect to be trusted. I don't think they do. I don't think they're ever set to be trusted. I think, in fact, or understood. In fact, there's a quote which is attributed to Mayor Rothschild, which I think is probably an anti-Semitic invention, but it is pretty true. When he said, I've got it here, the few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favours that there'll be no opposition from that class. And that really sums it up. That's the fact that a very small group of people control society. A former Labour politician, who I shan't name, described the financial system as a pyramid. Well, it's not at all. It's more like, if you can imagine an inverted champagne glass with a very, very small foot, little foot up there, and a huge bowl below. And that's a very small foot. A number of people, they all know each other, they're all working together. They are the chief executive of JP Morgan, the chief executive of the major banks around the world, and then there's a sort of a conduit which comes down to the rest of us, which is carefully managed by hugely expensive public relations entities in the US and here. As you know, I was an investigative journalist for the Times and the Telegraph, and then set up a corporate communications business specializing in takeover bids. And in that capacity, I worked with some of the biggest figures of their day. You know, Lord King, Lord Hampson, Lord Young, Lord Princess, Bob Maxwell, Ernest Saunders, just all of them all, really. And they all have something absolutely in common, which is they are concerned only with themselves. John King was probably the best of them. He was actually really rather concerned about British Airways, but primarily they're concerned about themselves only. And they would use any manipulation to increase their income. Now, I've said to you before that very interesting about how the very valuable research done by the people who presented first indicate how profits are manipulated in order to increase returns and therefore chief executive salary. But actually, the most common way is through share buybacks. Companies use shareholders' money to buy back the shares. That reduces the pool of equity, and the earnings impact on a smaller number of shares. It's pure arithmetic. There's no growth, but it does increase the EPS. And if that's linked to directors' remuneration, they do very well out of it. And it's a fix. It's a fraud.
Wow.
And that's the problem. We have lost the relationship between morality and regulation. I was asked the other day, and here's an illustration of it. I was asked the other day to meet a man called Mohammed Amersi, who is now very much in the news as a fixer, as a man who's accused of bribing the daughter of a former president of Uzbekistan. He is a huge Tory party donor. He and his partner gave 750,000 to the Tory party, and gave £10,000 to Boris Johnson's election campaign. And here is a photograph of him, which I appeared today, if you can see it. That's him. There's a chap you'll recognise, no doubt. And that's the heart of it. That is corruption or finance, speaking directly to power. Now, I say corruption. I'm absolutely convinced that Mohammed Mersi will never be charged with anything. Or if he is, he'll get away with it. Because he's a very clever lawyer. But he's, to my mind, probably, like so many of these people, a legalized criminal. And they are legalized because they spend huge sums of money with major, magic circle law firms and the big accountancy firms to make sure they're not breaking the law. But they are absolutely immoral. I live on the south coast, and I have a beach hut. It's a bit cold to go swimming, but I go swimming quite a lot in the sea. But I can't go swimming at the moment because the whole of the south coast is polluted by southern water spills. It's no accident to and that's the southern water will find 90 million drop in the ocean because by just allowing sewage to run into the sea and into the rivers, they save 230 million. So the return on crime is quite good. And of course, George Monbiot has made a very good film, which I recommend to everybody, called Riverside, as in not side like Wind in the Willows, but suicide. And it's criminal. Now, it isn't an accident, I believe, because I think it's a matter of culture and greed, that Southern Water is controlled by JP Morgan. And I believe that there's an evil thread of corruption, moral corruption, not financial corruption, because everything's legal, you see. Got to be careful about that. They spend huge sums of money making it legal. The banks, Lloyd's spent 600 million fighting small people who lost their money, despite the fact that GRG was a criminal organization. Lloyd's is my particular bête noire, actually. If you look at Lloyd's, the fines that Lloyd's Bank has paid, and do a little sum, which relates it to its capital versus that of even Bank of America, it is the most transgressive bank in the world. It's paid 20 billion in fines or something like that. JP Morgan's paid 45 billion since 2010. These are huge sums of money. And they will only be stopped. I know from dealing with the people I used to advise. I learned a lesson. I think I told you this story, Andy, and I apologize for telling you again, but I will because other people. I was called a long time ago, 1987, by the chairman of Wimpy, a man called Cliff Chetwood, who became a friend of mine. And he was in a terrible panic. And he was in a panic because the Herald of Free Enterprise had sunk at Zeebrugge, and a number of people had been killed. And he had nothing to do with the Herald of Free Enterprise. But the judge who tried the case had, in a way, invented, in his judgment, a new crime, which is that of corporate responsibility. And Cliff's lawyers, Wimpy's lawyers, who were Clifford Chancellor, told the board that they were in danger of being charged if anybody died on a building site. Now, I'm not really a commercial person, I'm all right in life with companies and things, but if I had had any sense, I would have gone out and bought shares in Yellow Jackets, because within 6 months, and I'm not exaggerating, it was within 6 months, all building sites receive Yellow Jackets, hard hats and boots. And these are things that the unions have been asking for years. But because the directors felt just the whiff of personal jeopardy, it changed things immediately. Now, I am absolutely convinced. I mean, if you look at Lloyd's, there's a very, very clear report which was produced by Thames Valley Police, which tells you that there are 15 people who are liable for prosecution at HBOS. They're headed by Lord Stevenson, who I used to know very well, Andy Hornby, and James, I've forgotten his name for a minute, but there we are, deputy chairman. But there are 15 of them for prosecution. They're never prosecuted. There's no reason why they shouldn't be prosecuted. And if they had, and Dennis Stevenson, I'm a Labour supporter, Dennis Stevenson's a Labour supporter, so it's not a political point. If Dennis had been arrested, even arrested, let alone banged up, That would have changed the whole banking system. I swear to you, it would have made companies would have been reformed from within. You wouldn't have needed regulation. These people would have made sure they did not transgress. John Sharkey, Lord Sharkey, tried to get an amendment to a finance bill through the House of Lords a few years ago, and it was to introduce into the finance bill for financial institutions the crime of failure to prevent. And he almost got there. It is introduced into the Bribery Act, into a couple of other acts. I think even tax actually. But he didn't get there. He tells me because Petty Ashdown had a dinner date, so he lost by 1 vote, but or 2 votes, I think, 198 to 200 from memory. It's a shame that didn't go through. It's the only way to do it. You know, these companies pay these huge sums of money. The companies pay the huge sums of money. Now, who does that affect? That affects the shareholders of the company. And who are the shareholders of the company? Well, shareholders of the company are people who have their money invested in pension funds. Mm. So if you take the case of the South Coast here, the JP Morgan owns this company. It will have raised money from borrowing other sources, maybe from other pension funds. But at the end of the day, the people who will suffer from the payment of fines are the very people who are being affected by the polluted water. The pensioners and people, especially around here, because everyone's a pensioner. So, so that's a double crime. It's a double evil. And it is. I use the word evil advisedly. It is evil, and we are absolutely controlled by corporations. We're controlled by corporations because corporations fund political parties. I had a great friend, Mo Molam, and we worked very, very hard to attempt to bring a German system of state funding in, because party political funding is so corrupting. I was head of funding for the Labour Party in '95, so a very long time ago. And I saw the city people move in. We set up a thing called the Labour Gala Dinner. In '94, we couldn't get anywhere, couldn't get anybody there. And in '95, we couldn't find a big enough place to, you know, people were clamoring for seats. They were lobbying. So, you know, it's a very filthy system. It will only be changed if we had a radical government. That's why I support John McDonnell. And he would have, I'm sure, brought in these reforms. And of course, his great mentor, in a way, is Prem Sikka, who I know you know, I've introduced you to. Mm. And he's doing fantastic work in the House of Lords, but he's surrounded by, you know, he's like one of those old prints you see of a bear being attacked by dogs. You know, he's a great bear, sort of batting away these horrible yapping dogs who are tearing at him all the time, who are very often people who are deeply involved in the crimes that he is attempting to change. So there we are. Can't go into that. I think it's all very simple. It's corruption.
Well, you make such clear and compelling points. It's always fascinating for me to listen to you, Brian. It really is. It really is. Did you watch the TV last night? You know, the Pandora Papers stuff on Panorama. Have you watched that?
No, but I'm in touch with the Guardian's investigative team, and I was a funder. Well, I was a founder, actually, one of the 3 founders of the Centre for Investigative Journalism, which spawned the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and these guys have got doing fantastic work. Do you realise that there are, just let me look at this, there are 2.94 terabytes of information in 11.9 million files, and and 6.4 million PDFs.
I watched it last night. I watched the first program, then there was another one, a bit of a deeper dive into it, and I came away from watching that pretty depressed, Brian, because it's, as you say, the system is corrupt. And when you make statements like the system is corrupt, people start thinking you're some kind of a conspiracy theorist or something wrong with you. It's really, but really is quite worrying. It seems to me, as you said to me before, that all the time we have a democracy that is being skewed by the influence of party political donations. We're never going to get what society needs. It's kind of as simple as that.
It's more than that as well. I used to know one of my friends, and I got some strange friends for a Labour supporter. They're all Tories, really. Was a man called Eric Sharp, who was chairman of Cable and Wireless, and I helped get Lord Sharp, who was the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, appointed as chairman after Eric. And they were both friends. They both are friends. Or Eric's dead, but David's still alive. Now, Eric's son, called Richard Sharp, was a partner in Goldman Sachs, and I got to know him. Obviously, I got to know Marianne as well, his mother, very well, who helped me set up a business called Primrose Care. She was gave me some very good advice. Very wise lady who Eric used to discuss every move with. So you've got some bright people there. And now Richard was a partner in Goldman Sachs. He resigned, I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that, with 1% of Goldman Sachs, which gave him 100 million in the bank. And I was talking to him one day. I said, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, we have an agreement. Here is a sinister thing. You know, he's a lovely man if you sit and have a chat with him, but he said, we have an agreement among the directors of Goldman Sachs that we will embed ourselves in society." I said, "What's that mean?" He said, "Well, we'll get into the arts and, you know, and just generally become involved in society." Now, that was as a way of controlling society. That was his motive. You know, we don't want society going askew. Richard became the biggest supporter of Anish Kapoor, and has just been made chairman of the BBC. So it works, doesn't it?
Wow. Really fascinating stuff.
This is so embedded. You know, David Cameron's father, who I used to know, I've forgotten the name of his broking firm now, Pamela Gordon, which I used to know well, was senior partner of Pamela Gordon. He set up an offshore trust for his family, and David Cameron has benefited from that, still does, I expect. Now, whilst you've got people in that sort of power, and I suspect most Tory politicians who make money will have offshore trusts, well, why in the hell should they reform the offshore financial system? If they're benefiting from it, we could reform so much because we have influence over, well, Jersey, the Channel Islands, Cayman Islands, but nobody wants to do it. And also, you know, our friend Anthony Stansfeld, who I think I've introduced you. Anthony Stansfeld was police commissioner for Thames Valley. And Anthony has railed against the underfunding of the police.
Yeah.
The fraud squad for so many. Well, that's not by accident. You know, you're right to say that when you say that you're ashamed or worried about being thought of as a conspiracy theorist, you shouldn't be, because it is a conspiracy. I called it a passive conspiracy. It's not, "Hey, Joe, if you do this, I'll do that." It's sort of the murmurings that you get in that that wonderful Anthony J. program, Yes Minister, which is comedy as a documentary. And that's how it happens. Yes, the police have got quite enough money, haven't they? They don't want to fund the police. I mean, you know, the HMRC tells us that it gathers 35 billion less than it should each year. Now, George Osborne put in austerity into this country, which has done so much damage to local authorities, to communities, to everything really, to welfare funding, and has had a tremendous effect. You know, as a result of COVID, you know, you can just look at the poorer areas of the country and see the COVID rates are through the roof and deaths are through the roof. So has a direct impact. One of the statistics that always interests me is that the life expectancy in North Kensington is 10 years less than it is in South Kensington, and this is directly associated with wealth and poverty. Now, you know, why wouldn't you, as a government? I mean, if you look at Richard Murphy, he says it's 160 million. billion. Other people, I think Prem thinks it's about 60 billion. Now that if you could collect that, you wouldn't have introduced austerity, and it wouldn't have had an impact on so many lives and caused such destitution. I'm chairman of a little charity called Running Space, which has been set up by a wonderful lady who attempted to kill herself, who is my running coach actually, and it's been set up solely to stop people committing suicide, and it works because it gets people together and gives them hope. But it's very evil. You know, it's very evil, and it could be stopped at a stroke.
Thank you, Brian. Nick's raised his hand. Nick, you have a point? Go for it.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks, very interesting, and very much admire your work. But the thing is, a lot of people say this: the system's corrupt. It's all very corrupt. Well, I've worked in countries like Russia and Nigeria. Those places are very corrupt. Right?
Sorry, Nick, you're speaking too quickly for my dim brain.
Sorry. So I've worked in places like Russia and Nigeria. Now, those places are very corrupt. Britain is a much better society, much better place to live. We've got lots of really good institutions, and you've got people like you are vigilant to try and stop the slide, but you've always got to be vigilant. And so corruption for me is a symptom. It's when, and in societies which the more unequal a society, the more corruption there is, the more a society is depending on resources, the more financialized it is, the more corrupt it is. So, and these are kind of long-term trends, and you actually need to address those, and then you get less corruption. And also you have to be vigilant about fighting it. But if you go to the system's corrupt sort of narrative, you then can be undermined by like Putin, who says, you know, we're corrupt, but so are you, you know, and everyone's corrupt, and you go into a sort of nihilism. Actually, it's you know, we've got to enhance our things that are institutions, which are why we're not like Russia or Nigeria.
Yeah, well, I dispute immediately that you say that we're less corrupt than Nigeria. I don't think we are. I think that's a patronising attitude to Black Africa. I've worked in Black Africa. I ran 2 elections in Malawi, and I had a lot of experience around that area. I also helped hand back Macau to the Portuguese, and I saw huge corruption with the triads in Macau. I believe that our corruption is so invisible because it's totally institutionalized. I think it's embedded more deeply in our society than it is in Nigeria. At least in Nigeria, it's visible, and I understand the police on the streets want a fiver to not nick you. But I think that in our country, it's completely institutionalized, and we have institutionalized corruption. I mean, for example, expressed by the honours system. That's, you know, that's simply a process of keeping people in line. People like me do raise our voices, and there are, you know, there's a whole lot of us raising our voices. Keir Starmer, who is a clone, as far as I'm concerned, of David Cameron, and probably to the right of Tony Blair, if you can imagine anybody being that far to the right, is trying to purge socialists from the Labour Party. So you don't have an opposition, really. All you've got are shades of conservatism. And that's a political statement, but if you believe as I do that politics is closely associated with wealth, that's been my lifetime experience. I've met a couple of very socialist billionaires. In fact, I once interviewed a chap who ran a company called Cope-Oram. I've got his name now. It's Mr. Lipstick, and he was a socialist peer, a socialist billionaire. And I said to him, "How can you be a socialist and a billionaire?" He said, "Sonny, to be a socialist, you need to be a fucking billionaire." So that was a point of view. And I have a friend, Clive Hollick, who's a millionaire, but he's very right wing in the Labour Party, and these people are stopping progress. I'm very fond of him, but they are stopping progress. We need radical change. We need to go. I use a photograph when I write to people. I can't bring it up on the screen. I don't have the technical ability to do it. I was so offended. I've been so offended. If you travel on Southern Region Rail, Southeastern Rail, as I do, you'll see a photograph, a poster no excuse for abuse. And it's a photograph of obviously a young man, because you can only see him from the waist down to his hand, and his hands are handcuffed. And it's a photograph saying, don't abuse the rail staff, you know. Well, what are we worried about? You know, obviously we should be worried about that. But we focus on blame changing. We focus on, you know, the government is now trying to blame people for the petrol shortage, saying that they try to blame people for COVID. I mean, it's complete and utter nonsense. And we fall for it solely because the popular press is controlled by people who are evil.
Wow, some really hard-hitting stuff here, really hard-hitting. We're going to be bringing everything to a close shortly. It's been a fascinating discussion with lots of contrasting points of view. Brian, thank you very much indeed. Does anybody have anything else before we start bringing proceedings to a close? Just wave your hand if you'd like to say something. Looks like we're all good. In that case, Brian, thank you very much indeed. Can we please show our appreciation to Brian? Thank you very much indeed for so candidly sharing your experience and insights with us. It's been great.
As you know, Andy, I was when you called me, I was in the bath, so I'm going to go and get back in.
Please do.
Just put a shirt on very quickly. I do have trousers on as well.
I'm pleased to hear that, and thank you for sharing that also with us, Brian. Have a good bath. Thank you very much, folks. Okay, guys, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all very much indeed. We've had a fascinating session talking about building back better. If I were to sort of summarize my own summary, I think we had Agnes and Justin and Monica giving us very hard evidence, suggesting the data's telling us that it pays chief execs of companies to take the kind of risks we really don't want them to take. And that's the data. The data is telling us that's a real problem for us. We've just heard Brian Basham share very strong views about what the way things are, suggesting there's corruption in the system, and I can absolutely understand why he is saying that. We had Nick giving us a masterful whistle-stop tour through lots and lots of ideas, talking about his paradigm shift that needs to be taken. And Nick, I have to tell you, your chart showing I think it was like pre-World War I, leading up to the crash, the kind of interwar years, and the kind of financialization paradigm ever since. I found that really powerful, and I'm itching to understand more about what it's going to take to move away from where we are now to where we got to. And we had a bit of time with Dr. Sharam Alijani talking about his polycentric governance theories, which are very well supported by numerous people within the Transparency Task Force. Polycentric governance being the basic idea that you need to have lots of different stakeholders pulling organizations in the right direction. It's been a fascinating conversation, and very thought-provoking too. Just before we wrap up, does anybody have anything they want to say before we do? I'll just check in with you all. In which case, we'll wrap it up there, folks. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good rest of your day, your evening, wherever you happen to be. Thank you very much, everyone. Super stuff. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, Monica, Justin, Agnes. Thank you, everybody.
Andy.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye all. Cheerio. Cheerio.
Bye.
Bye-bye.